now available in paperback and e-readers. Spellbound, A Darker Shade of Black. Get your copy today at your favorite online bookseller. President Donald Trump recently said that all sides who participated in the violence in Charlottesville were wrong. And I sadly have to agree with him that all sides in this violence that happened in Charlottesville were wrong. Now, a lot of people, they look at this from an emotional perspective, but I can look at the whole situation from an objective perspective. And when you look at the big picture of what happened in Charlottesville, all of the sides were wrong. Now, a lot of people will get emotional about those KKK, neo-Nazi, skinheads, and white supremacists for going to Charlottesville to protest the removal of Robert E. Lee, but they were within their constitutional rights as American citizens to do so. When it came down to those neo-Nazis and white supremacists and skinheads and Klansmen, they filed a permit to have their protest. They got a permit granted to them to have their protest. That was all done because under the Constitution, we all have the right to freedom of speech and freedom of expression under the First Amendment. And those racists and white supremacists were acting with using their freedom of speech and freedom of expression. People may not have liked them carrying those torches, but that was, again, part of their freedom of expression. They may not have liked the speech that they were using, but that was part of their freedom of speech that was guaranteed under the First Amendment. Now, when I look at the other side, which was the counter-protest, this is where the group was wrong. Your groups like your Black Lives Matter, your Antifa, and many others organized a protest without a permit. They went down to have a counter-protest without a permit, and that's what led to the escalation of violence at that incident. If they had not had the counter-protest, which was not organized, did not have a permit, we would not have had the violence. Now, where the white supremacists were wrong was they engaged these other people and had a back and forth with them. And that, again, led to the escalation. And then one of the younger white supremacists decided he was going to get emotional in the fight. And he escalated things to a higher level by taking his car and using it to ram it into the crowd. So all of the sides were wrong in this situation, because when I look at the bigger picture of it, I had to ask myself, why were those black people and those other people going to a protest featuring Klansmen, skinheads, neo-Nazis? What was the point of going down there to counter-protest them? These people had their permit, and they would have come and gone like they have in many areas and over many years. Because I remember back in the day, there were many groups like this which went out to have their protest. They had their controversy, and what people did to deal with these groups was they paid them no attention. They let them have their protest, they let them say what they were going to say, and then they went on about their business. And then what happened was these guys weren't given any attention, so they moved on. Yes, they made their protest, and then after that, people just went on with their lives. They just said, okay, he had his freedom of speech, his freedom of expression, and they moved on. But this group, because they were emotional, decided they were going to have this counter-protest, and that counter-protest, again, is what escalated things. They sat there arguing, going back and forth. And going back and forth with a racist and a white supremacist is completely illogical, because that's something only a dysfunctional person is going to do. Because this racist and white supremacist, who has been a racist and a white supremacist for most of their life, they are not going to change their opinion if you are going to argue with them. They are going to have their opinion. That opinion is not going to change. You are not going to convince them. And that's what's so completely illogical about these black people and all these other people going down there to have that argument with those people and to counter-protest them, because you're not going to show these guys anything. If you really wanted to show a racist something, you show a racist something by not paying them any attention. The more attention you give a racist, the more power you give a racist. And that says that to that racist that you validate them, you see value in what they're saying, and you give them power over you. The way to take power out of a racist and a white supremacist hands is to not pay them any attention, let them express themselves, and then you move on. If you really want to have an impact that changes things, you show that by your actions. And the actions of that counter protest is what led to the escalation, because just going there to argue with these people, go back and forth with them, that didn't do anything constructive to do anything. All that did was lead to things getting hotter and emotional, and that's what led to things escalating to the point where people lost their lives, because these people didn't understand what protest is all about. A lot of these people, yes, they read things in history books about these racists and white supremacists, but they didn't understand the approaches of people like Martin Luther King Jr. and those who participated in the civil rights movement. Because the people who participated in the civil rights movement, what people don't understand is they taught and prepared people for how to protest. They taught them that when you go into a protest, you can expect to get arrested. You can expect to get beaten. You can expect to be attacked. That's going to happen. And when you go out here, what's going to happen is you have to be able to navigate your emotions and control yourself. And they taught people how to navigate their emotions and control themselves so that they would not make black people look bad. So when they went out there to protest, they understood what was coming. What I saw with those black people in the Charlottesville and some of those white people in Charlottesville were people who didn't understand how to protest. Protesting and getting your message out is what it's about. You're supposed to be there to get your message out in a constructive fashion. Fighting with the other side doesn't get your message out in a constructive fashion. What those counter-protesters did was they made those white supremacists look like the victim. And that's what they did when they went out there attacking them, making threats, making statements, and verbally assaulting them. That counter-protest escalated things, and that's why those counter-protesters were wrong. And the white supremacists were wrong for engaging them because they didn't have any control over their emotions, and they went out and engaged these people. And you don't do that in a protest. A protest is where you make your points, present your arguments that disagree with the main point, and then you move on. Because I look at the big picture of this, and all sides were wrong in this. And what really makes the whole situation dysfunctional is that people will look at the white supremacists and say that they're the bad guy, but they won't look at the other side and see we're the bad guy. Moreover, they won't look at the other side and see how they are actually, many of them are closeted racists, and how they really want to talk about the white supremacists, but they participate in everyday racism, and they benefit from white supremacy, yet they want to talk about denouncing white supremacy, because many of those liberals, in their liberal states, they have policies that are just as racist and just as white supremacist as the ones that they say that the KKK, the neo-Nazis, and the skinheads participate in, but they do things in a passive-aggressive way to oppress black people. They'll sit there and talk about how this statute is racist, but they have policies in their welfare state that are just as racist, and they have equally discriminatory hiring policies that make it where you can discriminate against black men by doing things like saying, we'll hire this black woman or this Hispanic woman because they are a minority and a woman, but that's just as discriminatory and just as racist as that neo-Nazi or that Klansman or that skinhead. When it comes down to that Klansman, that neo-Nazi, and that skinhead, we know that they're racist. We know that they're white supremacists. And they are open about it. And when you have somebody who is open, you can at least respect them because they are honest about their racism. But when it comes down to those closeted racists, black and white, in that group, and even other races, that's where we have the danger, because these are people who are in denial about their racism, in denial about their white supremacy, and in denial about their codependency on white supremacy and racism, because the only reason why you would go down someplace to counter-protest a group of white supremacists is because you want to make yourself out to be the victim. You want the attention, and you really want people to see you as a victim, so you can get your needs met, and you can be the center of attention. I mean, when I look at that situation in Charlottesville, it could have been a whole lot worse, because some of those Klansmen and those neo-Nazis and skinheads and white supremacists, they were carrying weapons. And thank God they did not escalate things further than that young 20-year-old who went emotional and just ran his car into a crowd. Because if these guys had taken out their weapons and started using them in self-defense, that could have turned a situation into a full-scale riot. And thank God those guys did not go out here and take their weapons out like they wanted to and do that. Because if they were to have done that, that would have made things even worse. But you can't tell this to people in groups like your Black Lives Matter and many of these other groups. They're sitting there talking about, oh, we need to go down there and show these white supremacists. When the best way to show people is by paying them no attention at all. When it comes down to this case, I can honestly say all sides are wrong and all sides really are racist, but they don't want to admit their racism because they are in denial about it, and they are in denial about how they get benefits from white supremacy and racism. Moreover, they're also in denial about the codependent relationship they have with these people, because they need them to be the bad guy so that they can be the victim. And that's what we saw down in Charlottesville, that whole codependent cycle of racism in full circle. We saw the racists going down there to march and protest, and yes, they were in their constitutional rights, but they were saying that their rights were being infringed upon, and yes, they were right about that, and that's where they were okay on that. But here's where they went wrong, is when they went to argue with these people who were in the counter-protest, and that was, again, about codependency and being the victim. And in the aftermath of all this, what those counter-protesters didn't understand in their cycle of codependency is that everything got flipped, and instead of them being the victim, now everyone sees them as the abuser, and now no one really supports them because they're really showing us how codependent they are, because now they're the abuser, but then they want everybody is now seeing the white supremacist as the victim, and that's not the picture that should be. We need to understand that this racist issue really is a form of codependency. And it's a vicious cycle where people keep jockeying for this position of victim and abuser, and they keep looking, and this is how they get their needs met, by making themselves out to be victims and abusers, and playing this blame and shame game where the country winds up going onto a downward spiral where everything continues to decline because we're focused on trying to meet the needs of a victim and paying attention to victims instead of doing things that help the country grow and move forward. The only way we can make America really great is for Americans to start acknowledging the racism and white supremacy that goes throughout the country and make efforts to have a better future. Being the victim doesn't help anyone, and it keeps everyone stranded in a vicious cycle of codependency where everyone goes nowhere. All sides in this case were wrong because all sides don't want to admit that they all benefited from racism and white supremacy, and they benefit from this codependent cycle where they continue to play victim and abuser and try to win the sympathy of the world. If you'd like to see me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon by clicking the link in the description box. And if you want to try some of my SJS Direct titles like Spellbound, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.